Welcome to Nostalgia Nuggets, where I deep fry your brain meats in the oils of the past. And refuse to pay $60 for a 10-second clip of nuggets frying.
Who okayed this?
There are two things that bring me a sense of peace in life, and that is horror movies and metal music. As a kid, I loved monster movies. Godzilla, Gremlins, Eight-Legged Freaks. These were the kind of movies that defined my childhood. So naturally, I fell in love with the Sci-Fi Channel. No! Not that one. I'm talking old school weird as hell sci-fi. The sci-fi that brought us Warehouse 13, Stargate SG-1, reruns of Mystery Science Theater 3000 and The X-Files, and... I didn't say everything was gold. Point being, I was addicted to the Sci-Fi Channel, especially on the weekends where their whole block was nothing but creature features and horror flicks. My grandparents okayed it because most of what they showed was edited for television, so there wasn't really anything that could potentially fuck me up. But all that changed one night in 2004. I remember it fondly. I was being babysat at my Aunt Bridget's house. Usually my cousin would be home playing PS2 games with me, but he had to work late that night. So it was just me, alone, in his bedroom. It was the weekend, so I asked my aunt to tune his TV to the Sci-Fi Channel, which she did, but made the mistake of leaving the room afterwards. You see, on that particular night, a certain horror flick was making its television debut. A slasher flick that introduced me to two of the biggest horror icons of all time, and influenced my taste in music forever. My memory of how I reacted to the movie has faded over time. All I remember was Freddy scared the hell out of me. Growing up in the situation I was in, I had frequent nightmares, and the idea of one actually killing me freaked me out. And the fight between the two was freaking awesome. My aunt never came back to check on me after she left the room, so it was just me and the movie. I saw the whole damn thing. The nudity was censored, of course, but the violence was untouched. People getting hacked into pieces, limbs and blood flying everywhere, and there I was, a little 6-year-old kid watching in awe at the bloodfest taking place. Of course, my most vivid memory watching the movie was the fight, but it wasn't just the fight that caught my attention. It was what was playing behind the fight. That music, that holy shit punch the soul out of the nearest living, breathing thing straight to the pits of hell music. The OST was composed by New Zealand composer Graham Revell, who also composed the OST for Idle Hands, Pitch Black, The Bride of Chucky, and The Fucking Crow. In other words, a brilliant goddamn choice. It got my preschooler blood pumping. Then, when the movie was over, I heard this. That night back in 2004 awoke something inside of me. Something that fermented and grew as the years went on, matured as I matured. That night was when the horror addict metalhead inside of me was born. Now, of course, I have a bias. I was raised in the early 2000s, so naturally I gravitate towards early 2000s things. But music tends to be the medium I return to the most. I mean, look at this stack. This is a good 25% of my collection right here. I don't have a lot of CDs. But I'm talking like we got Three Doors Down, Disturbed, Lordi, Gorillaz. I fucking love the early 2000s, man. I love the 2000s so much. Horror, especially in the late 90s and early to mid 2000s, had a sort of kinship with metal music, more so specifically nu metal. It seemed like horror flicks of the time would spend top dollar for hit metal bands to appear on their soundtrack. Bands like Disturbed, Slipknot, Breaking Benjamin, Seether. If there was a metal band back in the new era of metal, they more than likely had a track in a horror film somewhere. Even bands that were more underground were getting contracts from film studios to have their music featured in horror flicks. A good example being 2003's Texas Chainsaw Massacre. For the soundtrack, they called on a band called Motograter to use one of their songs for the movie. Fun fact, that's Ivan Moody fronting that band. Motograter was Ivan's second band, I'd like to say, before he moved on to the band Ghost Machine and eventually found his home fronting Five Finger Death Punch, one of my favorite bands of all time. I don't care what y'all say, I like their sound.
You gotta watch for the shot, beware the ricochet, dance, motherfucker, till
Post-Identity Crisis. Now, this isn't to say metal and rock weren't prevalent in the horror circuit before this point. Metal and alt-rock dipped their toes into horror all throughout the 80s and early 90s. Motorhead's cover of Hellraiser for Hellraiser 3, Hell on Earth, Vinnie Vincent Invasion's Love Kills for Nightmare 4, Las Rockets' Leatherface for Leatherface the Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 3, the Goo Goo Dolls' I'm Awake Now for Freddy's Dead the Final Nightmare. And let's not forget the two most famous ones of all. He's Back, The Man Behind the Mask by Alice Cooper for Friday the 13th Part 6, and my personal favorite, Dream Warriors by Dokken for Nightmare on Elm Street 3. So horror has always had a sense of rock and metal in its DNA, but when the mid-90s hit and metal started to experiment with more aggressive and percussive sounds, so too was horror evolving with more aggressive and hardcore plots and themes, so it only made sense that down the line they would eventually cross paths. It was a good deal for horror and metal. The bands would get more exposure and recognition, and the movies would make a little extra dosh selling their albums to the headbangers. Dracula 2000, Queen of the Damned, Resident Evil, Strangeland, and yes, even Freddy vs. Jason. It was a win-win, but as time went on and new metal became more new than metal, the kinship sadly started to fade away. The last horror film that had the vibe I associate with this partnership in my mind was Saw 3D back in 2010. After that, the symbiotic relationship between horror and metal just kinda stopped. It was around this time that horror started taking itself a little more seriously in tone, and it's a tone that didn't really mesh all that well with the aggression of metal. Now, in this day and age, any song from any genre can be part of horror's sound. Even then, with how penny-pinchy studios are these days, I doubt they'd be financially interested in dumping a shit ton of money to license an album's worth of songs for multiple different bands for a single horror project. A genre that studios are already hesitant to spend too much money on in the first place. Not to say the relationship is completely dead and gone, the band Ghost has produced songs for both Halloween Kills and Insidious The Red Door, and there was a film that released relatively recently that, for the first time in the horror genre since Scream 4, I'm fairly certain, released an album of licensed songs that were used for the movie. The Retaliators. Retaliators is an action horror film starring a shit ton of metal and rock artists, including Spencer from Ice Nine Kills, Corey Marks, and yes, Five Finger Death Punch. The album is full of songs from those respective artists and more, like songs featuring Motley Crue, Hollywood Undead, Papa Roach, In Flames, Bad Wolves, and so much more. As for the movie itself, I liked it alright. It has a bit of plot whiplash in the final half hour, but overall I had a fun time with it, in no small part to the fact that the soundtrack is fucking awesome. That about wraps up the episode, but before I go, I'd like to give some recommendations in terms of horror albums. There are plenty of them out there, and you'll find most of these albums archived on Spotify. So if you're a fan of early to mid-2000s new metal like myself, go check them out. You won't be disappointed. Dracula 2000, featuring Disturbed, Saliva, Powerman 5000. But the true crowning jewel in the album, in my opinion, is the fact that it fucking has One Step Closer by Linkin Park. That's fucking awesome. Queen of the Damned. Speaking of Linkin Park, this album features Chester Bennington doing a solo track. It also features Disturbed, again, and Wayne Static in 2 tracks, one solo and one Static X track. I also just realized this album features 2 deceased vocalists, both of whom tragically passed away via heartbreaking causes. That's kind of spooky. Saw 6. Saw is one of those franchises I think works the most with this particular genre of music, and I like to think the creators felt the same way. The album features Hatebreed, Chimera, Memphis Mayfire, Danko Jones, which is strange, and features Your Soul Is Mine by Mushroomhead, which might be an exclusive to this album. I'm not entirely sure, but all I know is that if you search this song on Spotify, only the Saw 6 version of the song pops up, so it might be exclusive to that soundtrack. End of Days, a great album for possibly one of Arnold's worst movies. We're talking Korn, Guns N' Roses, Rob Zombie, Creed, and if you're tired of the nu metal genre, they also have a little bit of rap in there sprinkled in with Limp Bizkit and Eminem. And of course, I have to throw Freddy vs. Jason in there. It is easily my favorite horror album of all time. It also has possibly my favorite lineup of artists in any of these albums. Il Nino, Killswitch Engage, Mushroomhead, Slipknot, and Stone Sour for my Corey Taylor fans out there. Hatebreed, Seether, Lamb of God, Chimera. It is easily my favorite album out of the lot and is my go-to road trip album. I could listen to this CD on repeat for hours. Anyway, thanks for tuning in. I appreciate it. I don't really know what to make of this show yet. This was kind of a test run. I figured it could be like a show of like short retrospectives. Either way, I hope to catch you guys in the next one. Feel free to subscribe so you don't miss whatever crazy bullshit I decide to freaking post next. See you guys next time.